Okay, this is part 2 of the bird wing rigging tutorial. If you want to see part 1, where we cover a manual setup of a bird wing with feathers, you can go to tysonibel.com, tysonibele.com, go into the tutorial section and you'll find it there. But this is part 2, and as promised, we're going to cover scripting the creation of the feathers in this part, and that'll automate the whole process. In the last part of the tutorial, we started off by making our wing, our bones for our wing. Okay, then we created our feather. Just going to kind of recreate exactly what I did in the last tutorial very quickly here. Okay, so we have our feather here. Okay, we did that. And then what we did is we changed its pivot point to the end there. And then we copied a second feather to basically give each bone a feather. So those are our first two feathers. And then we're going to link these feathers to the bones, to their respective bones, and that gives us the first two feathers of our wing. Okay, this is still doing it all manually. This is obviously no scripting yet. Then what we did is we copied a feather, gave it an orientation constraint, and then set the two previous feathers as the targets, and that will balance the third feather in between the first two. And we basically repeated this process for, we added a feather in here and weighted it between these two. We added a feather in here and weighted it between these two other ones. And we did that over and over and over again until we had a whole bunch of feathers that all spanned out nice and evenly. The problem with that is it can take a lot of time, as I mentioned, I believe in the last tutorial. For a realistic bird or something, that's going to take a really long time. If the bird is 100 feathers or something in the wing, no one, you're not going to want to have to redo that whole process 100 times. So now we're going to automate the process using MaxScript. And this is actually, even if you're new to scripting, this is a very simple process, very easy to learn. Before I started, playing around with MaxScript, I was always very kind of intimidated by the whole thought of programming code and whatever. But MaxScript is very intuitive. And most of the code that we're going to need to use, 3 Studio Max will give to us just freely. And I'll explain that in a second here. So basically we're going to set up our MaxScript to automatically create a third feather in between two previously selected feathers with the proper orientation constraint. And that way, to very quickly make a nice bird wing, all you have to do is select two feathers, run the script, it'll make a third one in between, select two more, run the script, it'll make a third one in between. We could go the extra level and just make a script that allows us to select two feathers and then ask us for a number, and then it'll create X number of feathers in between those two. Basically create the whole entire wing for us in one step. But that does get a little bit more advanced and requires a UI for the input of the X number of feathers variable and whatever. So we're just going to leave it at a very simple script that just basically automates the setup of the orientation constraint for us. So the first thing we're going to do is open up our MaxScript at listener, and this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to use to get all of the code, basically all of the code we're going to need for the script when it comes to setting up the controllers and whatever. The one thing that's great about the listener, if you're not familiar with it, is basically it mirrors every command you do in Max with the code equivalent of it. So if I create, just for example, let's say I create a point helper right where I click. If you look on the screen right here in the MaxScript listener, it's giving us the code equivalent of what I just did. So just to show how this works exactly, if I copy that code, okay, delete that helper, and then paste the code into the MaxScript editor down here, press enter, which will run the code. It's going to do exactly what we just did. And that can be really handy, because if you're ever looking for a function, if you're ever writing a script and you're looking for a function in Max that you don't know what the code is for it, instead of going on the internet and going through the help files and researching and whatever, you can just do the action manually. Let's say I want to have a script that generates a sphere somewhere. Do the action manually, and then just use the code that the MaxScript listener gives you to repeat that action. Of course, you can edit that code however you want, but that'll give us the basis for what we need. So, okay, so the first thing we're going to want to do is have the script copy one of the feathers that we selected. Because both feathers are the same, it doesn't matter which one it copies when we run the script, just as long as it copies one of them. The first thing we need to do is figure out what the code is, the max script equivalent is to copying an object. And because, like I said, this should be this tutorial is for people who are already relatively familiar with MaxScript. I'll just say it, the code for copying an object is copy. It's as simple as that. And but before we run that, we need to tell it what to copy. So just typing in copy, that tells MaxScript that we want to basically duplicate something, but it doesn't tell us what to duplicate. Now the MaxScript code for your object selected is a money symbol. Notice that I'm just typing all of this in this window here. You can do that. MaxScript will be able to interpret that. So basically when we type in copy money symbol, that's telling MaxScript to copy the object that's selected. So as you can see, it's this feather that's selected. If we run that by pressing enter, it's going to give us the value of the copied object, and as we can see here, now we've got two of them. Okay, so that's going to be our first line of code. So I'm just going to delete delete that duplicate one there. Okay. Alright, so we have our first, we're going to make a new script, and we have our first line of code. That being said, if we make our script start off with copy money symbol, or $sign, that's not going to work properly, because what we want our script to do is allow us to select two feathers and then duplicate one of them. If we do copy money symbol and evaluate that script when two feathers are selected, it's going to make two copies, okay, because it's copying each one that's selected. So what we want to do is we want to, if I just undo that, we want to only copy the first object in the selection array. When I select more than one object, it creates an array of objects, but we only want to copy the first one. And normally we'd want to be a little more specific, but because all of these feathers are the exact same object, it doesn't matter if it's the first one or the second one or the third one in the array. So just to keep it very simple and efficient, we just want to copy the first one. So what we're going to do is change the script a little, and instead of copy money symbol, which means all the selection, we're going to copy the first value in the selection array. So what that's going to allow us to do is if we select these two objects, and actually I'm going to use, so I don't mess up that little rig down there, I'm going to use different objects for this example. If we select two objects and run the script, it's only going to copy one of them. You'll notice there's no duplicate over here, there's only a clone of one. So already we're a step into our script here, because we've got, if we pretend these are two feathers and we run the script, it makes a duplicate third feather, and so that's already step one. The next thing we're going to want to do is once we have our feather copied, we want to give it an orientation constraint. And similar to the way we set this up, where we copied one of these end feathers, gave it an orientation constraint, and then balanced it between the two, we want to allow our script to be able to do that. So the first thing we need to do is figure out what command to give MaxScript. What command we should give MaxScript to create an orientation constraint in an object. So with our handy listener, we're going to bring that up again. We're going to create just a dummy test point. This is just going to be for testing purposes only. We're going to go to the motion panel and we're going to assign it an orientation constraint. And right away in our MaxScript listener, it gives us the code for what that command was. So if I were to copy that code and then change that point's rotation controller back to TCB rotation, and then paste the code down here again, and then run it, you're going to notice it changed it back to an orientation constraint. Okay, so right away we have our second line of code. So what we want to do is we want to, so our script, we want it to copy the selection, but if we just paste this down here, and of course we don't want to have it, well, I guess what I'm getting at is, certainly if we copy the selection, it's going to make a copy, but then on this line, how does it know what object to apply that orientation constraint controller to? Right now, because we just copied that script right out of the MaxScript listener, it's telling it to give 0.01 a rotation controller, but we don't want to give 0.01 the orientation constraint for its rotation controller. We want to give that new feather the orientation constraint. So, and we can't just do selection I, because when we made that copy, it changed the selection. And if we do selection I, it's not going to give the right object the orientation constraint. So, one thing cool about MaxScript is you can assign any command to a variable when you create a new object. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a variable called new feather, and we're going to tell new feather to equal that copy selection, selection copy. What that's going to allow us to do is when we select these two feathers and run the script, whoops, I'm not going to run the script yet, but when we select those two feathers and run the script, it's going to copy one of them and then assign this variable that new object. So that way we can interact with that new copied feather by calling up this variable. So what we can do then is do new feather.rotation.controller equals orientation constraint. And as if we do a test here using some points to show exactly what we just created here, we're going to select both the points, pretending they're both the two feathers. We're going to evaluate the script. Here we can see it gave us our copy, and we're going to go in the motion panel, and as you can see, our copy has an orientation constraint. So we're almost done. I mean, it doesn't get much easier than this. So we have one more step, and that is to assign the targets for the orientation constraint for that new feather. Okay, so now that we are at the point where we have these two lines of code, which basically copy one of our objects and give it an orientation constraint, similar to the way that we set up this wing feather here, we just need to do one more thing, and that's assign the orientation targets for the orientation constraint on that new object. Now, this is pretty much just as easy as all these other lines of code. The other thing we're going to need to do is, at this point, so far we're only interacting with one object at a time. But we want Max to now interact with both of the original feathers that we're using in both of the feathers that we originally selected for the script, so that we can assign both of them to the orientation constraint controller. This is where it gets, like I said, a little bit tricky if you're not familiar with MaxScript. But basically, what we're going to be doing is making a for loop. And it's for, F-O-R, not for as in the number 4. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to create a for loop which is going to run through all of our selection, and at each loop it's going to basically interact with a separate object in our selection. And you know, a for loop can work for any number of objects, but we only need to interact with these two feathers and add them to the orientation constraint. So basically we're going to create a for loop which goes as follows. We're going to say for, then we're going to choose just a completely arbitrary random variable. We're going to call it I, and then we're going to type for I in 1 to 2 do, and then we're going to create an open and a close bracket. Basically what that's saying is we're setting a beginning and an end of our loop, and that's going to run this for loop twice because our beginning is 1 and our end is 2. If we said for I in 1 to 200, this loop would run 200 times and then it would finish. But we only need 2 because we're only running through 2 feathers. And so basically the idea is we have this for loop and we're going to run it, and when we run it, it's going to run through both of these feathers and tell MaxScript to add each one to the orientation constraint. But before we do that, we need to find out what the MaxScript code is for adding an object to an orientation constraint. You know, you can't just type in, you know, add feather 1 to orientation constraint. There's a, you know, obviously a specific, that'll generate an error, obviously. There's a specific bit of code. So we're going to once again do a test, creating 2 pretend feathers, running the script. So we have this third feather here. Oops. That would be this one, lightly colored one. As you can see, it has the orientation constraint, and we're going to bring up the MaxScript listener by pressing F11. And I'm just going to clear the window here so that we don't have all that extra code in our way. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring up our MaxScript listener, and we're going to add our orientation and target and grab the code from the listener. Oh, but we see that the listener isn't recognizing that as something that it has code for. And that's one of the things with the listener, is it's a great tool, but not every function in Max will give it a line of code from what you do. So now what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to jump in the help file and bring up our trusty help file, and this is where an excellent example of the importance of having help files handy and not just completely relying on internet forums or chat rooms or whatever, because this will give us quick and instant results for what we need. So we're going to type in orientation constraint. This is the MaxScript reference, and you can download that from the discrete, or I should say the Autodesk website. Did I spell it wrong? I think I did. Okay, and we're going to, so here we have our orientation constraint MaxScript help file. And here's the code. Here are all the different functions that you can control using MaxScript, and you can set. And because what we need to do, whoops, just move that window there. Because what we need to do is add a target, okay, to this third point here. We want to add two targets actually. We need to figure out what line of code, what command is going to allow us to do that. And if we go down here, we can see that append target. Well, that makes sense. Adding a target is, appending means adding on to something. So that is the line of code that we need. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to copy that, even though it wouldn't be too hard to spell that from memory, but for the sake of time, we'll just copy it. And the way to interact with controllers is we copy the controller code, and then we're going to put a period that separates each of the functions, and then paste. Whoops, I guess I didn't copy that append target. We'll do that again. It must have copied something else. Okay, so we're going to copy that append target and then paste it in there. And that's basically telling the object's controller to append a target. It's pretty straightforward. Now, the only thing is, what target do we want it to append? If we just type this in, MaxScript is going to get to this point and say, well, that's great and all, but I don't know, you haven't told me what target to add to the controller. So, as you can see in here, in this explanation of all the methods for this controller, certainly you have the append target command, but you also need to give it an actual target node and a weight for which can be a float number, which means it can have a decimal point. Because as you can see, if I manually add a target, it's going to not only assign a node but also a weight. So if we're going to script that, we also need to tell Max to do that. So we have that code so far. Here's where the for loop comes in handy. Instead of typing in, okay, we want to append the 0.01 as the target, and then with a weight of 50. Instead of doing that, we can actually just procedurally add the target. Because the problem with typing in something like 0.01, with a thing of 50, is that if we change the object's name or decide to do something else, this code will only work with 0.01 because we've told it that. But if we do something like selection I, okay, that will choose whatever object in our selection based on the for loop. Remember how we set up this variable, this I variable here? Well, what happens is whenever this for loop runs, every time it loops, it changes this variable I to whatever number we're at. So if our for loop is 1 to 200, so it runs 200 times, and we're at the 50th time, I is going to equal 50. Or if we're at the 60th time, I is going to equal 60. And the great thing about that is that we can then reference this number in our code down here and use it to our advantage. So as you can see, we have two objects that we want to add to this target. That's why we're running our for loop twice, from 1 to 2. That's going to run it twice. And because we're going to have we have two things in our selection array. Remember how we did up here? We only wanted to select the first thing, so we did selection 1. If we wanted to select the second thing, we do selection 2. because we have a selection array with two objects, we can tell it to append the target which is in the selection array based on where we are in our for loop. So if we're in the first round of our for loop and I equals 1, this line, and we add our weight at the end, this line is going to tell it to append the first object in that in the selection array, which would be this object. And once the for loop runs its second time, I is going to equal 2, so it'll tell it to add its second object. So basically, having this loop here, that'll automatically run through both of those objects and add them to the array. So why don't we try this script? So we've selected let's start fresh here. So let's say we have feather number 1, feather number 2. We select them and we run the script, and now we have feather number 3, and it has an orientation constraint with 0.1 and 0.2, both with a weight of 50 in its controller. And if you'll see, if I rotate the points, it will automatically adjust accordingly. So that is the entire script, 5 lines long, not hard at all. And as you'll see, let's test it on our final rig. So we're going to do the same thing that we did with the points. We're going to select both of the feathers we want. The first thing we're going to make sure we do is change the pivot point interpretation to local, so that it's adjusting the orientation based on its pivot here, because we want it to rotate on that pivot. And we're going to run the script, and boom, we've got our third feather in the middle. And if we adjust the end, there we go, it's ready. So then what we'll do is we'll run the script again, and as you'll see, it didn't do it correctly. It copied the feather. Okay, here's our copy, or this should be our copy, but it didn't rotate it in between these two, and we'll see over here why. Instead of just 2 targets, this feather that we just made now has 3, and the reason for that is that it already had an orientation constraint set as its controller, because it was already weighted between these 2 feathers. So, and you'll notice here that if we give an object something like an orientation constraint, and give it a target or something, and then overwrite that with another orientation constraint, it's not going to change this. It's not going to reset anything. And because when we're generating a new feather, we're just copying one of the other feathers, it's not resetting anything. It's just adding another target onto the 2 targets that are already there, and that's not a good thing. So I'm going to delete that feather already created. And you also note that over on this side, it worked. We didn't have that problem. That's due to the fact that the script copies the first item in your selection array, and what happened is we must have selected this one first and this one second, so it duplicated this feather, which didn't have that orientation constraint on it already because it's one of the end feathers. So we're going to add an extra line of code in our script to basically reset the controller of the copied feather. And all we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this line, and instead of adding 2 orientation constraints, we're first going to add a TCB rotation. And what that's going to do is when we copy a feather, let's say it already has an orientation constraint, first it's going to copy it, then it's going to give it a TCB rotation constraint, which will basically reset the orientation constraint and change the controller. And then we're going to give it an orientation constraint again, which is going to give it a fresh and new orientation constraint, and then we're not going to have the problem. So you'll see now, if I select those 2 feathers again and run the script, now it fixes that problem. And we can do that for any number of feathers. Okay, and you can see how much faster this is than the previous method we were using, the manual method in part 1. And of course, like I said, you could set up a script. So look, in a matter of 10 seconds, I just made, a whole bunch more feathers, and you could keep doing that. Like I said, though, you could set up a script to continue subdividing these arrays so that all you'd have to do is click 2 feathers, and it would make X number of feathers in between them. So for example, we'd select these 2 feathers and tell it to make 6 feathers in between, and it would automatically set that all up. But because that requires a little bit of extra scripting, we're not going to deal with that today. This is fine for now, and as you can see, this is still, even though it does, it does still have a couple extra steps in it, this is still a very fast process. I'm just selecting, 2 feathers at a time, evaluating the script, and over again we're getting obviously new feathers generated, and they're all working, and that's quite the nice little wing going on with the feathers. So I guess I could save the script. And we're going to call that, I guess, wing script. And the last thing that's kind of cool, this is just a mention that I forgot to mention in part 1, is not only does it maintain the orientation on this one rotational axis, but also on any other of the bone's rotational axes. So you can pretty much, this script is really neat in the sense that all this fanning will happen on any axis, and that really just kind of helps the process of animating or whatever. If you need the feather to flap in the wind or something like that, that's a really neat way. And as you can see, all the feathers are being equally weighted amongst those 2 bones. So here's a very cool and fast technique to and easy to rig a bird's wing. So hopefully that helped you out, and hopefully it was not too boring to listen to. Once again, I'm Tyson Ibel. You can visit my website at tysonibele.com, or you can email me at tyson@tysonibel.com, or you can check out my forums. That would be simplycg.net, and hopefully you'll be able to use this in your own animation. So that's all for now.